About 40 years ago, when American cities were struggling with decline and disinvestment, one of the byproducts was arson. By the early 80s, Boston was just starting to recover when it was hit by a combination of mandatory budget cutting, an economic downturn, and a puzzling series of fires. The fires would attract national attention, but also the attention of our guest as a federal investigator for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. He recently took that to a new level with a book called Burn, Boston, Burn. We'd like to welcome the author, Wayne Miller. Thank you very much for being with us, Wayne.
Thank you very much for having me.
Right, I think in these times back in the 1970s, early 80s, arson was not unusual, but I remember I was living in Dorchester at this time, and I remember it was almost like clockwork. Every Thursday night, I would hear all these sirens. There was something strange about this series of fires, wasn't there?
For some reason, these guys chose Thursday night into Friday to set their fires to begin with. And they established this pattern week after week, setting multiple fires every single Thursday night, up to even 7 in one night.
And I guess what's also unusual here is that there was a clue here about what was going on at the time politically here, because 1981, which is when I think this all started, it was the year that Proposition 2.5 went into effect. And for people in the neighborhoods, what was the drama that they saw around that?
There was somewhat like 600 firefighters laid off or through attrition. They were lost. And firehouses and fire engine companies were closed down throughout the city. Over 20 companies were closed down, including one in Hyde Park. The station was just closed down. East Boston, they closed down the firehouse completely.
And at least they had a couple of places. There were neighborhood people there occupying the houses, or at least parking their chairs out in front, weren't they?
In true Boston style, they were like patriots, and they were protesting the closure because they feared for their property and their lives.
Well, what about the people setting the fires? Maybe they thought of themselves as patriots. I don't think the rest of us did, but what kind of people were they?
Well, we had one Boston police officer and 2 Boston Housing Authority police officers, and 3 of the men were firefighters, one of them being a Boston firefighter. Altogether, 8 guys set these buildings on fire over a 2-year period. They formed this conspiracy, and a 9th one joined in later to help one of them evade the authorities.
Now, I know when people were talking about these fires in past years, there was a tendency to talk in broad strokes. So some people figured they were just like mainstream firefighters, union activists. But you see them as something much more of a splinter group, don't you?
They were fire buffs, besides what they did for a job. They had a hobby of being fire buffs. And there are lots of fire buffs in the world who are very...
Well, what does a fire buff do exactly that the rest of us don't?
They collect equipment, they collect photographs, memorabilia, and they do like to go to some fires, not every one of them, but they go to some fires and they photograph and watch the firefighting operations. So this group, that's how they all met. But they became the militant faction, and they joined together. When Prop 2.5 started cutting everybody, they said, this isn't right for the city. We have to do something.
Now, of course, the thing that's hard to imagine is that firefighters or even fire buffs would tolerate people getting killed or injured. What about the toll from these fires?
That's one of the most incredible things. Even now, 35 years later, I think about it. The East Street Military Barracks fire occurred on October 2nd, 1982. 33 firefighters got hurt that night, came crashing through the roof, broken backs, broken legs. That was October 2nd. October was the 3rd most prolific month for these guys setting fires, approximately 40 fires, and most of them being after October 2nd. So in spite of the injuries that they were causing, they still kept fighting, lighting these fires.
Now, you use the term domestic terrorism for what was going on here. Why does that apply?
It wasn't being used back in 1982.
We didn't hear that. I know. I remember. Yes.
They are local, in-house Boston people, and they are terrorizing the neighborhoods. They are holding the city captive, sort of like an extortion plot. The threat letter that was sent out was sent to WBZ News. And that threat letter said, if you don't reopen and hire everybody back, we're going to continue to burn. And if you tear down the unoccupied buildings, we will target occupied buildings. So they were terrorizing the city. People were awake night after night. You lived in Boston. You heard the sirens. And it scared the people.
Did this group, did they, aside from that letter, have any other way of communicating or describing themselves? What did you find about that?
Well, they, in their personal lives, drove what we called Nerf police cruisers. And they thought of themselves as being on duty as legitimate officers of the law, even when they weren't at the time. They'd go cruising down the streets of these fires and they'd turn on lights and sirens. They were just not the same as everybody else. And a lot of the local people saw them and said, let's stay away from them, they're trouble. But they couldn't identify what the trouble was.
So how did you find it? I mean, you were investigating this, and you must have been awfully puzzled for a while. What cracked the case?
It was frustrating. The entire summer of '82, we were just running from fire to fire with the Boston Arson Squad. And finally, the second Garrity lumberyard fire in Hyde Park in Dedham Line.
Near Reedville, actually, right?
Yes.
Right.
The second one was November 21st of '82. And 4 or 5 of these guys, the arsonists, were sitting on a lumber pile when Nat Whittemore, who was a cameraman for WBZ for years, he used to chase fires also. He was a legitimate spark himself, but he got paid to do it. Nat happened to see this rowdy group actually cheering and just being boisterous. And he swung his camera over to them. And Robert Grabluski, the Boston police officer, pulled his sidearm out. And momentarily, it focused towards Nat Whittemore, who was in fear of his life for a moment. And then Grabluski raised the gun in the air and waved it around and was yelling crazy. And when other friends told him he was being filmed, he put the gun away. Because of that, WBZ called Boston Police, Boston Fire, and ATF, and we viewed that and identified the players. We interviewed Robert Grabluski a few days later at his apartment in Weymouth, and he had one of those red fireboxes that usually sit on a post somewhere, right in his living room. My partner, Bill Murphy, saw it and took the number, 1712. We raced back into Boston because we had the list. There was 14 missing that year. Most of the time there's only 1, and because these were being taken off the post on purpose. And because of that, we got Bobby charged with receiving stolen property. And that was the beginning of the end. And then, in the summer of '83, we recovered a stolen car. They stole it out of Natick Ford, a brand new police unmarked cruiser, destined for Randolph Police, to update their own personal cruisers. And they dumped the rest of the vehicle into the Fort Point Channel. And when I had a source of information within the group, he was giving me just tidbits of information, not saying anything about setting fires, which he actually said about 50 himself, and he never told me that. He told us the car was in the channel. When we recovered that, eventually we interviewed Grabluski again, and he confessed on January 13th of 1984, almost 2 years after the beginning of their crimes.
Also intrigued, you kept a journal, and I know that's normal for the work of a federal investigator, but what was it like when you had that journal where you had these entries, one after another, and you saw something that looked really fishy?
Every week we would talk amongst ourselves into the Boston fire, and we'd say, who's doing this? At one point we'd have 20, 25 people maybe on a list of potential suspects. We'd take 2 of them off because we eliminated them. We'd add 2 more. And, the patterns that we're developing, the fires on a certain night, certain locations to pull fire personnel to one location, then a fire set where they just left from. Was it possibly the union that was involved? So many guys being laid off, in one sense, that's a legitimate reason to believe that. This group was so much harder because they were just a splinter group of individuals who happened to be fire buffs and like fires, but they knew firefighting procedures very well. Each one of them had wanted to be a firefighter, even the Boston police officers.
Now, it sounds like when you set the fires at multiple locations, I know there's common sense that you're going to make things more difficult, but I'd also, reading into that people who know what it's like in the department, because when you have a multiple alarm fire in one place, companies go from another firehouse to fill in, and then you have more of a sort of a shortage elsewhere. I mean, they seem to be familiar with that, right?
Yes, absolutely. And they kept saying that we want to bring them to their knees. And they would set so many multiple alarms in some nights that fire crews came from as far away as 30 miles away. I mean, Weymouth was here, Cambridge was here. I think Fitchburg came in one night. That's pretty far away.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Wayne Miller, the author of Burn, Boston, Burn. Wayne, you kept a journal, but it turns out that at least one of these arsonists kept a journal as well. Tell us about that.
Gregg Bemis, who I actually have contact with right now, still talk to him, gave me additional information to fill in some of the blanks for the book. Gregg, when he finally confessed, he testified in 2 trials and got a 30-year prison sentence. While he was in prison, his first year or 2, he started typing. 166 pages, single-spaced. What they did, what they said, what they were thinking. And I know Gregg well enough. I spent over 200 hours with him back in 1984 after he confessed, debriefing him and prepping him for trials. And Gregg's memory was fantastic back then, and it still is today. So what he put in his journal is very truthful, honest, and I know a lot of those stories. And I heard the stories back in '84 from Robert Grabluski, Joe Gorman, one of the other arsonists, and from Gregg. And so I know it's what he wrote in his journal is truthful.
Why do you think he kept a journal?
I don't think Gregg was aiming to write a book. I know one of the other guys did at one point, hoping to get in with a major author somewhere. But I think it was therapeutic a little bit for Gregg to put it all down, and he actually sent it to Lieutenant Steve McLaughlin from Boston Arson Squad. He sent it to him. He was very friendly with us, Gregg was. He always was. He never got angry with us for arresting him. It was his own fault. As a matter of fact, Gregg sent us Christmas cards while I was in prison. And like I say, I have a relationship today with Gregg.
One of the other things that struck me, and I don't know whether you had to find this out in the journal or maybe you just found it out from investigations on the scene, was the ingredients that were used in setting the fires. They sound so rudimentary.
You mean how they set the fires?
Yes, what they did.
Yes. You know, in the old days, you might not want to tell everybody what the device was like, but today anybody can find it on the internet, and they can read the public record on this case, and they can read my book and figure out how it's done. But it's just a brown paper bag with Coleman fuel in a Ziploc plastic bag, some tissue, and then a matchbook with a cigarette laced in between. And they would light that cigarette the last second, put it in the bag, and place it wherever they wanted to in the building. Eventually they added there were so many tires and vacant lots around here. They added the tire because once you get the tire going, it provided a better ignition source to ignite building products, such as the wood siding. They loved the asphalt or gasoline shingles that were on so many buildings in the Boston area back then.
Of course, another part of the investigation was that you had an informant. What was that like?
Well, we couldn't actually enlist him as an informant because he was a police officer. He was one of the Boston Housing Authority police officers. He was my source of information, and it was very frustrating. Mr. Sandin provided me with information starting the beginning of 1983, and he would say things like, they set a car on fire that was stripped and left in South Boston. That meant nothing much to me. It didn't fit under federal guidelines, and nobody would really care about that. And then he said they set a fire in a car that caught onto a building. Okay, that's a little juicier for me. But he wasn't giving me much. And he was involved with approximately 50 fires himself, and never once admitted to those 50 fires. But he was the one who gave me the information about the car being in the channel. And that was the second major break that we had in this case. And why he was giving me the tidbits and then not giving me the whole story, he could have saved himself an awful lot of jail time. I think he had a 26-year sentence. And, you know, even in front of the judge, I don't think he confessed in front of Judge Zobel at the time. He just kept quiet about it afterwards.
Well, you did an investigation. I guess this case was resolved in the courts, but you went back to it and wrote a book. How did that change your sense of what happened?
You know, at times when I'm writing the book, you can see some of these guys and you can sympathize a little bit with them because of the way it's written with a lot of Gregg's words in there. And you can see Gregg growing up in particular. And you can see some of these people. Mr. Stackpole, who's deceased, he was described as one of the meanest in the group. And as I read the words and wrote the words, I could feel the anger, especially, you know, again, back to the East Street military barracks fire. When all the firefighters got hurt, he said, screw those firefighters. They were up on the roof. They shouldn't have been there. He was the only one that really didn't care about the firefighters. The other ones did, in spite of their actions. They still talked about caring about them. But so at times, I'd feel angry as I'm typing the words. At other times, there were funny things that happened in this, and you know the seriousness of the whole thing. But there's still funny stories too.
Of course, the other thing that I'm picking up from you is that the line between the good people, the people who go to fires and try to save lives and risk their own, and the people who cause all this mischief and harm, can be very thin. Absolutely.
At the very beginning, I put a fire triangle in the book. A fire triangle: oxygen, fuel, and heat. You remove the heat like firefighters do with water. You remove the heat, the fire goes out. These arsonists were introducing the heat. So I described it as the perfect symbol for the yin and the yang between firefighters and arsonists. They both lived together. These guys visited the firehouses. They sat and had dinner. They went to a picnic with the fire buffs, who were a lot of firefighters. So it was a very strange relationship.
Okay. We should mention, if people would like to track down the book, get a copy, is there some way they can do that?
Absolutely. My website is www.burnbostonburn.com. I have PayPal buttons, and Amazon. It has all hardcover, paperback. Kindle is there now, and coming in November is my audiobook.
Great. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Wayne Miller, and the book is Burn, Boston, Burn.